The billionaire turned down every woman until the cleaning lady arrived with her daughter and changed everything. Some stories begin on an ordinary day, without warning, without anyone noticing that something is about to change forever. And that's exactly how this story begins, in a silent office with a sheet of paper in the hand of a man who had learned to want nothing from anyone. Harrison Sterling was the kind of man who filled any room just by walking in, not because of the way he spoke or the suit he wore. It was the silence he carried with him, a heavy silence, the kind people feel before they even understand what they're feeling. He was 46 years old, with brown hair graying at the temples, and a look that had already seen too much to be impressed by just anything. The Sterling family was known throughout the tri-state area as people of means. A construction company founded by Harrison's grandfather, grown by his father, and now in his hands, at least that's what most people thought. In reality, Harrison managed the visible side of the company, the meetings, the contracts, the name. But the one who truly worked the numbers, who moved through the behind the scenes of the finances, was his uncle, Arthur Sterling. 62 years old, a grey mustache, and a soft voice that very well concealed the coldness of his actions. Harrison carried a wound that wouldn't heal. 5 years earlier, he had lost Claire, his wife, to an illness no one saw coming. They had been together for 15 years, and overnight, he found himself alone inside a huge house that still smelled of her perfume. Since then, the entire family had tried in every possible way to get Harrison to live again. His sister, Natalie, had even arranged dates disguised as dinners. His mother, Mrs. Eleanor, at 72 years old with a stubbornness that defied time, was even more direct. "Harrison, you can't spend the rest of your life clinging to a memory," she would say, with that firm voice she'd always had. But he refused. He turned them down one by one. The partner's daughter, who was beautiful and well-mannered, the lawyer a cousin introduced him to at a party. The university professor Natalie thought was perfect. There was always a different reason, but deep down, the reason was always the same. Harrison simply didn't want to. And then that Monday morning arrived. Mrs. Martha was there, as always. 32 years working for the Sterling family. She knew that house like she knew the back of her hand, every corner, every sound, every silence the rooms held at night. She was 64 years old, with hair almost completely white pinned on top of her head, and she wore the blue uniform with the white apron she ironed herself every week. Martha wasn't just an employee. She was the living memory of that house. She had raised Chloe on her own after her husband left when the girl was 3 years old. She worked all day at the Sterling mansion and returned to the small room she rented on the east side, on the other side of town. Chloe grew up knowing her mother never had the luxury of coming home and complaining about being tired. She grew up learning early the value of a thing simply by the effort it costs. Chloe was 22 years old, dark brown, wavy hair falling over her shoulders, eyes that seemed to always be paying attention to more than one thing at a time. She had spent the last 3 years in Oakland, studying business administration at a college where she managed to get a partial scholarship. The other part her mother paid. She always paid, without complaining a single time. And on that Monday morning, Chloe came back. It wasn't an ordinary visit. She had finished college, yes, but the diploma wasn't what brought her there. She needed a letter of recommendation signed by someone with a recognized name in the market to compete for a spot in a training program at Metro Corp Enterprises. Without that letter, her name wouldn't even be read. It was her mother who suggested asking Mr. Harrison. "He's known you since you were a little girl, Chloe. He knows who you are." Chloe wasn't so sure about that. She remembered Harrison as the serious man from the office who sometimes showed up in the kitchen to get some water and barely looked up from his phone. Kids didn't seem to register on his radar. But her mother insisted, and Chloe went. The two of them walked in together through the main office of the mansion. Harrison was sitting behind the big dark wood desk in a suit and tie, even though it was Monday morning, with a stack of papers in his hand. He looked up when he heard the door open, and for a second he stared at the two of them like someone trying to remember a name that had slipped from his mind. "Mrs. Martha," he said in that usual dry tone. "Is there a problem?" "No, Mr. Harrison, sorry to bother you." Martha made a discreet gesture toward her daughter. "It's my Chloe. She just graduated. She needed a quick word with you if you had a minute." Harrison looked at Chloe. That young woman with wavy hair standing near the door, with a plain folder under her arm and a look that wasn't pleading or shy. It was just direct. "What do you need?" he asked. Chloe took a step forward. "A recommendation letter. It just needs your signature and a paragraph saying you've known me for years. I can write it out if you want." Harrison slowly lowered the papers in his hand. "You can write it out," he repeated, as if hearing that for the first time. "Yes, I know you're busy. I don't want to take up more of your time than necessary." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't do that sort of thing." Martha opened her mouth, but Chloe was quicker. "That's fine." She gripped the folder more firmly. "Thank you for your time." And she turned to leave. Harrison watched the door as the two of them left. He didn't call her back. He didn't say anything else. He went back to his papers, but something had lingered. That afternoon, Arthur Sterling showed up at the office without warning. He did that often, walking in as if the house were his too, tossing his jacket on a chair and treating his nephew with a familiarity that Harrison sometimes found a bit much. "I heard Martha's daughter came by asking for favors," Arthur said, helping himself to water from the bottle on the desk without asking. Harrison looked up. "How did you hear about that?" His uncle shrugged. "Word gets around, Harrison. You know how it is." He sat down in the chair across from his nephew and crossed his legs. "Good call refusing. That kind of situation creates complications. Martha is a good employee, but she's an employee. You have to keep your distance." Harrison didn't answer, but something about it bothered him in a way he couldn't quite explain. That night, he went to the kitchen to get a coffee around 10. Martha was still there, putting away the last of the dishes. She heard him come in and didn't say anything, as she always did, but Harrison stopped in the middle of the kitchen and asked out of nowhere, "What's this program Chloe wants to get into?" Martha stopped with her hands inside the cabinet. She turned slowly. "It's a position at Vanguard Construction, sir. Your biggest competitor in the tri-state area, if you don't mind me saying." She said it without irony, just with that direct honesty she'd always had. "She studied 3 years away from home for that scholarship. I saved what I could to cover the rest. The program she wants is 2 years. It trains you for construction management. It's her life, sir." Harrison just looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because it's not my place to ask favors from the boss, Mr. Harrison." She closed the cabinet carefully. "She's the one who asked, and you said no. Done." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now back to the story. Harrison spent the next 2 days thinking about it more than he should have. He didn't quite know why. Maybe it was the way the young woman had walked into his office without humbling herself. Maybe it was what Arthur had said, with that condescension disguised as advice. Maybe it was the exhaustion he'd noticed in Martha's shoulders there in the kitchen, a weariness of decades that he had never truly seen before. On Wednesday morning, he asked Martha to call Chloe. She came, same posture, same look. Harrison pointed to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Chloe sat. "Tell me about the program." She talked, and she talked well. Not with exaggerated enthusiasm, but with precision. She knew the company's history, knew what the program required, had a clear vision of what she intended to do afterward. Harrison asked a few technical questions, the kind he'd ask in interviews for positions within his own company, and she answered without hesitation. When she finished, he stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Leave me the folder. I'll write the letter." Chloe didn't show exaggerated excitement, just a nod. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison." "Don't call me Mr. Harrison. Harrison is fine." She left. Martha was in the hallway when Chloe passed by. The two of them didn't need to say anything. Her mother just placed her hand on her daughter's face for a second, as if confirming that it had actually happened. What neither of them knew was that writing that letter had made Harrison open a drawer he had kept locked for a long time. He had a habit of keeping important documents in a side drawer of his desk. Old contracts, letters that were never sent, and an envelope Martha had placed there 3 years earlier, saying that the late Claire had asked her to hold on to it until it seemed like the right time to give it. Harrison had never opened it. There was something in that envelope he didn't want to face. As long as he didn't open it, Claire was still on the other side, waiting for him, and he could still imagine what she would say. If he opened it, it would be over. But when he picked up Chloe's folder to write the letter, his hand brushed against the envelope by accident. He froze. He took the envelope out of the drawer, held it in his hands for a long time, looking at Claire's handwriting on the paper. Her script had always been small and slanted to the right, as if the words were always in a hurry. He opened it. It was 4 pages, and as he read, the office grew quieter than any silence he had ever heard. Claire knew she was going to pass. She knew even before she told him. And in those 4 pages she had written things he needed to hear, things about himself, about the company, about his Uncle Arthur, and one part Harrison read 3 times before he could absorb it. Claire had discovered, in the last months of her life, that Arthur had been siphoning company funds for at least 6 years. She had seen documents by chance, had noticed inconsistencies that anyone more attentive would have caught earlier. And she hadn't told Harrison, because at the time he was already devastated by her diagnosis, and she didn't want to leave him with that weight on top of his grief. But she wrote everything down. Account names, dates, approximate amounts, and she asked Martha to hold on to the letter until she felt Harrison was ready to read it. When did Martha choose to deliver the envelope? 32 years working for that family. And the woman knew exactly when the time was right. Harrison sat in that office for a long time afterward. He couldn't work, he couldn't eat. When Martha came to knock on the door to let him know dinner was ready, he got up from his chair and walked to the hallway. "You knew what was in that letter," he said. That wasn't a question. Martha didn't look away. "Yes, sir." "Since when?" "Since the day Mrs. Clare gave it to me, a month before she left." Harrison just stared at her. "Why did you wait so long?" "Because she asked me to wait. She said, 'Martha, you'll know when the time is right, when he stops carrying the grief and starts carrying his life again.'" Martha's voice didn't falter, but her eyes welled up. "When your Chloe walked into this office this week, I felt it was time. That hung in the air between them. Look, I had to take a deep breath here before continuing, because what Martha did, carrying something that heavy for 3 years, alone, waiting for the right moment, that's no small thing. It's the kind of loyalty you rarely find in life." Harrison called his sister Natalie the next day. He showed her the letter. Natalie read it in silence, and when she finished, she set the paper on the table with a calm that cost her dearly to maintain. "Are you going to confront Arthur?" "I'm going to do more than that," Harrison said. "I'm going to have an independent auditor review the last 10 years of the company. Everything, no exceptions." Natalie nodded. Then she looked at her brother differently. "Are you okay, Harrison?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet. But I'm here." That was the most honest thing he'd said in years. The audit was discreet, but Arthur sensed something was shifting before he was even officially informed. He went to Harrison's office one morning and tried, with all his decades of skill, to spin an alternative narrative. He said he had made risky financial decisions. Yes, but that everything was justifiable given the market context. He said he had put his own money back in during critical moments. He said the company wouldn't be standing today without him. Harrison let him talk. He listened to all of it. And when Arthur finished, he placed on the table a copy of the documents Claire had described in the letter, documents the auditor had confirmed and expanded upon. "I didn't come here to discuss," Harrison said. "I came to tell you that you're leaving the board, voluntarily or otherwise, but you're leaving." Arthur turned red. Then he turned pale. Then he got up from his chair without another word and walked out. Natalie, who had been waiting outside, heard the door slam. She walked into the office and looked at her brother. "Is it over?" "That part, yes." The part that wasn't over was what Harrison felt inside, because alongside the anger at Arthur came a different pain. The pain of realizing Claire had carried all of that alone while facing her own illness. She had protected him until the end, and he hadn't even known. In those days, Harrison started showing up in the kitchen at odd hours more often, not for coffee, to talk to Martha. She answered when he asked, and didn't push him to speak when he stayed quiet. That had a value he was only beginning to understand. One afternoon, Chloe showed up at the house to tell her mother she'd received a response from the program. Harrison was on the porch when she passed by, and without any planning, he said, "So?" She stopped. "They called me for a second round, an interview with their board." "Do you have a date yet?" "Next week." He nodded. Then he said, "If you want to do a mock interview before that, let me know." Chloe stood still for a second as if processing. "Really? You did well when I interviewed you last week, but a board is different. They apply pressure." She looked at him with that look of someone trying to figure out if she was being tested. Then she said, "All right, thank you," and she left. Martha was at the kitchen window pretending she hadn't heard a thing, but there was a smile on her lips that she made a point of hiding. The mock interview happened 2 days before the scheduled date. Harrison was relentless. He asked about management cases, about decisions under pressure, about what she would do in a situation where 2 departments of the company presented conflicting data. Chloe answered the first questions well, hesitated at one point in the middle, and at the end recovered with an answer that made Harrison go quiet for a few seconds before continuing. "That last answer," he said. "Where did that come from?" "From my mother," she said. "She always says that when you don't know what to do, you go back to the basics. The basics never lie." Harrison looked at her for a moment, then he lowered his eyes to the sheet of paper in his hand. "All right, you're doing well." Chloe went to the interview, and she came back with the news 3 days later she had gotten in. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. When Martha found out, she stood holding her daughter's hands in the middle of the kitchen for a long time, unable to speak. Harrison was passing through the hallway at that moment and saw it through the half-open door. He didn't go in, but he stood there for a moment, looking at the scene. There was something about it that moved him in a way he couldn't quite name. It wasn't envy, it wasn't sadness. It was almost like a reminder of something he had stopped looking for. That night, Mrs. Eleanor came for dinner. Harrison's mother was 72 years old, with completely white hair and a way of observing people that made everyone feel like she was reading a book only she had access to. She noticed her son was different. Not euphoric, not cured of anything, just different, as if something had shifted slightly inside him. After dinner, when Martha went to bring the coffee, Eleanor gently held her arm and said, softly but not softly enough, "You're a good woman, Martha. I've always been one." Martha just tilted her head. "You're very kind, ma'am." Harrison, who was listening from the living room, turned the cup in his hands without saying anything. The following week, the company restructuring really began. With Arthur out, Harrison had to take over the finances temporarily while hiring someone he could trust. It was during this review that he discovered something the audit had flagged, but that he hadn't fully processed on the first read. There was a side account, opened years ago, into which Arthur had diverted a considerable amount of money, and the mailing address on that account, whether out of carelessness or arrogance, was the address of the upstate estate that Arthur used under the name of a shell company. Harrison showed it to Natalie. "He's going to try to deny it," she said. "Let him deny it. The documents speak for themselves." "And what do you want to do about it?" Harrison went quiet. That was the question. He could destroy Arthur publicly. He could take it to whatever authority was necessary. He could make enough noise for that name to never be forgotten for the wrong reasons, but he could also demand the money be repaid without a spectacle and close that door for good. He chose the second option, not out of generosity, out of exhaustion, and because he knew that Claire, who had chosen to protect him rather than start a war while she was dying, wouldn't have wanted him to spend the next years of his life in the middle of a fight. Arthur signed the agreement. He returned what he could, and for the rest, he put up a property as collateral. There was no farewell lunch. There was no speech. He left overnight, and the company remained standing. That whole process took almost 2 months. And during those 2 months, Chloe had started in the new company's program and spent her weekends at home with her mother. Sometimes she showed up at the mansion to pick up Martha. and sometimes she ended up staying in the kitchen drinking coffee while her mother finished the last chores of the day. Harrison started noticing when she was there. Not in the way people looking in from the outside might imagine. It wasn't that kind of thing. It was more like noticing that the house had a different sound to it. A laugh coming from the kitchen, an animated argument between mother and daughter over something trivial, a presence that broke a silence that had lasted far too many years. One afternoon he came downstairs to get something and found Chloe alone in the kitchen, studying her program materials with a pen in her hand and her forehead slightly creased in concentration. She looked up when he walked in. "My mum went to hang the laundry. She'll be back in a minute." "That's fine," he said. He went to the refrigerator, grabbed what he needed. He was about to head back upstairs when she said, "Can I ask you a question?" He stopped. "Go ahead. How do you make a decision when you're not sure if it's the right one?" He turned to her. "What exactly are you talking about?" she explained. There was a situation at work, an analysis she'd done that contradicted what her supervisor had said. She had the data, she had the reasoning, but she was new and didn't know whether she should speak up or keep quiet. Harrison set what he was holding on the counter, pulled out a chair and sat down. "Show me the data." They stayed there for almost an hour. Harrison was direct. No condescension, no forced kindness of the kind people use with someone they assume won't understand. He treated Chloe the way he would treat any analyst on his own team, and she met him at the same level, pushing back when she disagreed, adjusting when he pointed out a mistake. When Martha walked back into the kitchen and found the two of them at the table with papers spread out, she stood in the doorway for a second before coming in. She didn't say anything. But that night, before going to sleep, she found herself thinking about Claire's letter, thinking about how life sometimes finds the path it needs to find through routes we could never have imagined. I don't know if you're feeling the same way I am as you follow this story. There's something about that connection that formed there, between a man who had closed himself off from the world and a young woman who walked through a door that had almost been left unopened, that feels to me so much bigger than the sum of its parts. Weeks later, Chloe presented the analysis to her supervisor. He pushed back at first, as expected. But the data was solid, and when the analysis reached the program's leadership, the feedback was positive. Chloe was mentioned in a meeting as a standout in the group. She told her mother, who happened to mention it to Harrison over breakfast, or maybe not so much by accident, who knows, with Martha. Harrison listened, and all he said was, "She's got a good head on her shoulders." Martha agreed with a small smile. "She always has." Around that time, Natalie started showing up at the mansion more often. She'd grown curious about the changes she was noticing in her brother. Not big changes, not dramatic transformations, but small things. He was eating lunch at proper hours. He'd picked up the morning walks he'd abandoned 3 years ago. He replied to messages the same day. For anyone who knew Harrison well, that was a lot. "You seem different," Natalie said one afternoon. "You're the second person to tell me that." "Who was the first?" "Mom." Natalie smiled. "She always notices first." Harrison stared out the window. "I read Claire's letter." Natalie fell silent. "She left me a series of instructions," he continued, "about the company, about Arthur, but about other things too." He paused. "She wrote that she wanted me to become the man she'd known before all of this, that that man was still here, that I hadn't let him go. I'd just buried him under the grief." Natalie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "She was right. I know. And now?" Harrison didn't answer right away. "Now I'm trying." The following month, Harrison made a decision that surprised even Natalie. He created within the company an internal training program for young people from humble backgrounds who had completed higher education on a scholarship. 3 paid positions per year with direct mentoring. The idea had been born from a series of conversations, some with Chloe, others by himself at night, rereading parts of Claire's letter. Martha found out through Natalie's son, who mentioned it in passing. She didn't say anything to Harrison, but one morning when he came down for coffee and she placed the cup in front of him the way she always had, there was something different in the way she did it, a dignity even more present, as if something inside her had also settled. Chloe finished the company's program with distinction. 2 years of hard work, of nights studying, of long phone conversations with her mother when the exhaustion grew heavy. And on the day she received her certificate and the formal job offer, she went to the mansion before anything else. Not to celebrate. To say thank you. Harrison was in his office when she knocked on the door. She walked in and stood on the same side where she had stood 2 years before. When she came to ask for a letter, he almost didn't sign. "I want you to know that this letter changed everything," she said. "Not just because it opened the door, but because it was the first time someone outside my family believed in me without having to." Harrison looked at her. Then he said, "You're the one who believed in yourself, Chloe. I just signed a piece of paper." She shook her head slightly. "No, it wasn't just that." And they both knew she was right. Martha, who had stopped in the hallway without meaning to when she heard her daughter's voice, stood there for a moment. Then she walked slowly to the hallway window and stood looking at the garden. The afternoon sun came in from the side the way it always did at that hour, illuminating the plants she herself had tended for 32 years. She thought of Claire. She thought of the letter kept for so long. She thought of her daughter inside the office, standing with her whole life ahead of her. And she felt that she had done everything right, not in a grand way, not in a way the world would notice, but in the way that matters, with patience, with loyalty, and with the quiet certainty that some seeds take time, but they sprout. Mrs. Eleanor showed up that same late afternoon, as if life had carefully arranged that date. She greeted Natalie's granddaughter who was visiting, had the tea Martha prepared, and when it was time to leave, she stood at the living room door looking at her son. "You're back," she said. Harrison didn't answer, but he didn't look away, and that, for anyone who knew that man, was already the most complete answer that existed. End of story. This story got to me in a way I didn't expect. There's something very beautiful about the way Martha waited for the right moment all those years, carrying something heavy without complaining once. And there's something very honest about Chloe, who walked through that door without asking for any favors, only asking to be seen for who she was. If you've made it this far, you know the weight of this story. Tell us what you thought and where you're watching from. And one more thing. Do you think Martha did the right thing in waiting so long to deliver that letter? Leave your opinion in the comments. We read everything. Thank you so much for your company. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories like this one.